Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here at the Fabricator Stage. I want to give a quick thank you to some of our associate members here at Natural Stone Institute. Make sure you visit their booth. Rockheads, visit their booth. ISFA, great over in the corner. Yeah, make sure you visit their booths. Great and valuable organizations and that will help you build your business, help you engage and help your business thrive. Today, I'd like to introduce our speakers that have been speaking with us all morning. They need no introduction. Rich Katzmann with the Rockheads Group, and Ed Young with Fabricators Choice. Thank you very much, and turn the time over to them.
Thanks, Blake.
Thanks, Blake.
Quick further introductions, real quick, because we've been up here for a while. I'm Rich Katzmann. I run the Rockheads Group. Real quick commercial on the Rockheads Group. 118 like-minded fabricators across the country. We consider them the best of the best. They get together, they share best practices, they network together. We do an extensive benchmarking study because they submit their financials and their operational data. So they all basically make themselves better shops. And then we've got world-class vendors that support them. So that's the Rockheads Group. I came from Laser Products prior to running the Rockheads Group, and have also done commercial installs for years too. Mr. Young?
Thank you, sir. I'm Ed Young, the Fabricators Coach. Prior to this industry, I worked in manufacturing, all sorts of manufacturing levels, run manufacturing plants, done a lot of coaching and consulting in manufacturing plants, actually been in several hundred manufacturing plants, both U.S. and internationally. I've run a fab shop. I've had my own brick and mortar business, so those of you who sometimes have to reach back into the hip pocket to make payroll, done that on too many Fridays myself. But this industry is a lot of fun. Working with folks who own and run their own business all the time beats working with these corporate organizations that get all siloed and get crazy with their metrics. This industry is a lot of fun. There's a lot of good opportunity here. And what we want to do is just share with you some of the things that we've learned, hopefully to help you improve your business.
Nice, nice. And just a little further on myself. Prior to being in the stone industry, I actually worked as an M&A consultant. And I had also started up a water conservation plumbing company that we engaged an investment banker in and interviewed a bunch of PE acquirers and eventually sold to a strategic investor. So got a little bit more background on M&A than some of the other topics I talked about today.
And PE, for those of you who don't know, is private equity. Yeah. We got a few acronyms. We'll try to keep you up to speed.
All righty, let's get right into this. So this clicker always. So we're going to talk about, just as Ed had said, the different types of companies that might be interested in buying yours. We're going to talk about business valuations, right? How to do some rough approximations of what your business is worth. And then probably the most important part, what can you do now to drive up the value of your business? So there's a lot of things that can be done in addition to just growing it that will increase the value. All right, lots of words here. At the end of this, we're going to have a QR code up here, so you can just scan the QR code and you'll get the presentation. So you don't have to be writing all this down. But there's a couple of different ways to value a business, multiple, 6, 7 different ways. We're going to focus on what we call EBITDA multiple. And your EBITDA is essentially your gross profit in your business. You take out a couple of factors that aren't operating factors, appreciation, depreciation, or amortization. But really what EBITDA does is it gets to what your business is earning every year. And what acquiring companies will do is they will take that value and they'll adjust it a little bit based on a couple of factors, and then they will multiply that, and then that becomes what they're willing to pay for your business. And so there's multiple things that can affect the total amount of money you get, right? It's what your EBITDA is, how much adjustments to your EBITDA get made, and then what you would multiply that by to get your final number.
I think understanding this process is critical. I can't tell you how many shop owners I've talked to that said, yeah, I want you to help me get my business ready to sell here in the next couple of years. Number one, they're behind schedule. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they think, well, I've got a business that does $3 million a year in sales, so it's worth at least $3 million, right? Not the case. And some of the toughest conversations that I hate to have with the shop owner is somebody who thinks their business is worth this, and when you walk through some of this math, it's actually worth this. And that's really, really tough conversation to have with those folks. So it's good to understand this now so you're prepared for realizing some of the benefit for all the efforts you've put into your business.
I've had clicker trouble all day.
You'll get good at this by tomorrow.
Look at that. I hit it once and it does that. All right. Is this it? God bless it. Stop. All right. We've bundled this into 4 different types of companies that may be interested in buying your business. For larger companies, right, you have access to private equity, right? This is a fund of money that high net worth investors or institutional investors have put into a fund, and their job is to go out and buy companies, grow them, and then sell them and spin them off. That's kind of the private equity model. In general, private equity isn't going to look at you unless your EBITDA, your profit, is $5 million or up. Now, there's a big exception to that. If private equity is already investing in similar companies and they have a main company, they will bundle or add a smaller company on, and a lot of private equity companies will come down to $1 or $2 million to do that. Again, EBITDA of 1 to 2 million. Generally, though, they're looking for much larger companies. Strategic partners, right? So this is something like a building supply company, a cabinet manufacturer, a design center. We've seen RDC and IDC roll up shops too. So these are companies that aren't in the business. They're not investment companies, but they're rolling up industry companies like ours. After that, local regional competitors, right? You can find those everywhere, right? Someone down the street wants to grow their service territory. That's a very common occurrence. And then our last one that we've seen a couple of times in the Rockheads is someone who's made a lot of money in a previous life and for some bizarre reason wants to get into our business, right? And we'll come in not knowing much, but we'll buy the business and try to grow it and try to implement what's been successful for them in other businesses. Ed, what are your thoughts?
I was going to say that last category I'm seeing more and more of these days. I have folks who came in from another industry, bought a fab shop, worked with it a while, struggle with it, and then want some help to figure out how do I get this thing to work? And so I get a lot of those folks giving me a call saying, hey, can you give me a hand? So some interesting things to look at as far as how that transaction goes, the impact on your people, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah. So this is a little hard to read, but this is kind of the summary. If you think about private equity, again, they have a fixed timeline. They buy the business and they want to grow it and then they want to sell it, right? So they have much different desires than, say, a local competitor who wants to grow his business and continue to run it for years and years. And so there's an effect on culture and employee based on the different type of person acquiring it. If you are very much an employee-first owner, right, going to private equity probably isn't going to make you sleep well at night. Now, going to a local competitor will, right? They're going to keep your employees, they're going to work with them. The whole idea of private equity, bundle a bunch of things together, pull out the common services, call centers, anything, accounting, marketing, pull that out and centralize. So that means a lot of your employees will end up being redundant and no longer with the business.
Yeah, having worked with some private equity companies who've done some acquisitions, not necessarily in this industry, but some others, I can tell you a lot of the employees that made the transition, and a lot of them won't make that transition, by the way, a lot of those folks are walking around and kind of with a look of shock on their face because it's a totally different way of running a business than the way most owner-operators run their business. So if one of your core values is taking care of your people after the transition, you might find a private equity company where that acquisition can work out, but chances are that's going to be a tough match.
And I can tell you across the industry right now, there are multiple private equity companies looking at our industry right now. I get calls every few months from them. There are a handful of large regional players looking at growing their business too. So there are a lot of opportunities out there to sell. And so if you're interested, you can find those opportunities. All right, so back to kind of what we talked about earlier. EBITDA is your profit, right? That's what your business is making. How to get what your business is worth, you multiply that number. Traditionally, EBITDA multiples across all industries range from 3 times to 20 times. So if your business is making $1 million a year in profit, if you're a 3 multiple company, you can sell it for $3 million. If you're a 20 multiple company, you can sell it for $20 million. So massive range of what multiples can be. A lot of the higher end ones are financial services companies, high tech companies. In the manufacturing world, which we live in, they're generally 4 to 6. They've been pretty tightly kept in that range for years. And so, again, as you're doing your own math, if you put yourself in the middle of that and say, if I'm doing some right things, I can multiply this and probably get a 5 multiple out of it, and that's what my business is worth. That's probably the easiest way. What Ed and I are going to talk about here in a few minutes is, say you're not a great company right now and you're generating a 3 multiple or a 4, what can you do to get to the top of that range? Because there are definitely some things that almost all acquirers are going to look for.
This multiple is driven by a lot of things, some of which are up on this slide, but also too realize sometimes a lender will drive a multiple. I was talking to a business broker not long ago who was telling us about an acquisition that he coordinated, that he brokered, and the lender came in and said, oh yeah, you're in the countertop fabrication business, our multiple is 3.2 for that industry. And so if that's the lender that the buyer is using for an individual buyer, that's the multiple you're stuck with. So realize that sometimes those factors come into play as well. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do the stuff we're getting ready to talk about. Yeah, Ted.
How old are your slides? Multiples come down in the last few years.
Okay. So, Ted, what are you guys seeing out there? What are you offering?
Here, Ted.
A turn less than that, 2.5 to 5. 5 would be high. Again, that was back in the heyday when everybody was paying those turns there on smaller companies, right?
Yeah, but you guys will go all the way down to 2.5.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what's
At the low end, you don't get
Yeah.
many of those, or else the guy really needs to sell it.
Okay, right.
all right? So Ted, in your estimation, based on what's transpired the last several years, what's been happening to drive that multiple down?
Access to funds, the large acquisitions, private equity, like when they were borrowing at 3% and 4% interest, the multiples were super high. And now that the interest 7-8% is where the money's coming in at, the multiples have suffered as a result of that. So it's really access to capital for those big guys and their cost of capital, cost of borrowing.
Interesting.
Are you seeing any impact from supply and demand? That whole graying, baby boomers aging out, wanting to cash out, much more businesses being available for sale. Is that having any impact on that?
On the price, no. There are lots of people ready to sell, and it's really it's a market-driven thing from our experience. That's only talking our experience.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
and the timing of the baby boomers, that's not over yet.
Right.
Oh yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Great. Thank you.
So that comes from a guy who's actually actively out there buying companies. So you can't get better data than that.
Yep.
All right, so back to the what drives multiples, right? And size matters is definitely a factor of what drives multiples. When they're on the lower range, it's generally a smaller company. And if we think about that, it's because there's more risk associated with the smaller company, right? If you're a $5 million shop or a $3 million shop, you probably don't have as many procedures in place. You might be customer heavy in one segment. You've got more risks associated with your business than if you're a bit of a larger shop.
Yeah, and a classic example of that is an owner who runs their business, and they're what I call kind of the long pole in the tent. You pull that pole out, the tent collapses. If you're the owner, and if your business can't run without you being there, your multiple is going to be really low. And so that's why in smaller businesses, there's typically a lot more risk because usually it's very personality dependent. The relationships with customers, based on the owner's personality, the relationship with suppliers based on the owner's personality. The business has been more of a lifestyle. It's not been set up as an independent vehicle that can be transferred from owner to owner. So that's one reason, one big reason why these smaller companies are just, they're tougher to get a good valuation on.
The next dominating factor we see is a management team, right? It's how good is your management team. If you're selling and you're going to eventually leave the business, your next layer down, how good are they? That's what the acquirer is looking at too. They don't want to come in and replace everybody at the top couple of levels. So you've got to have a good, strong management team in there. And in hand with that, you've got to have a good set of procedures and processes, because you're gone, right? If the business is run well because of secrets and things that you know, and you're going away, that does not hurt. That does not help the people coming in. So you need to document everything, have standard operating procedures out there. When I talked to your partner, that was the number one thing he said when we were back a year ago, is that you guys look for processes and procedures as a huge driver upward in multiples.
And so if you own a business and you're trying to figure out, all right, is my documentation sufficient? Is my management team strong enough? Think about going on vacation for a week, turning your phone off, and never looking at your computer. Can you do that and people are still making good decisions and the business is still running well and is still profitable? Or are you still essential to that business? If you're the owner and you can't do that, you need more documentation. And when we talk about having good processes and procedures, there's this cardinal rule. If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. So you got to have them documented, got to have them written down, have them organized. People have to follow them. You need to have KPIs, key process indicators, that show that you manage to those processes and that you're on top of what happens when people deviate from those processes and performance changes. Those are the things that a prospective buyer are going to look at to say, okay, how self-sufficient is this business without the owner?
And then next on the list, clean financials, right? You've got to have buttoned up clean financials, right? That takes a big risk out of the business. So whether you have an accountant, a third-party accountant doing it, even if you're doing it in-house, you've got to make sure they're clean. Things like wives' salaries, boats, other things like that need to start coming off of the balance sheet and off of the P&L statements. You got to keep them clean.
Got to have them clean, and a lot of shop owners are entrepreneurs. Some of you are serial entrepreneurs. You've got more than one business. I can't tell you how many folks that start looking at their P&Ls and they've got the rental apartments in there, and they've got another business that they're running on the same site that does something totally different, and all that cost and that revenue is in there. Muddies the water for a prospective buyer. So get them cleaned up, and quite frankly, I always recommend, especially for smaller shops, have an outside CPA looking at it. Somebody outside who's not part of your business, that's a CPA, that's looking at your financials, is going to make a buyer a lot happier, a lot more comfortable with the data that you present.
Yep. And the next, diversification, right? You don't want all your eggs in one basket, neither does someone buying you, right? The old rule of thumb was no customer should be greater than 20%, right? So if you've got a big track builder, if you're doing any big box work, you don't want them ever bigger than 20%. So that's a huge factor too in removing risk. Management reporting, right? Kind of the same. You talk KPIs, you talk benchmarking. I mean, all of that stuff needs to be in place.
And when you think about all these processes, procedures, reporting, financials, one of the bullet points here says clean financials for 3 years. And not just clean, but financials that show consistently good performance and preferably improving financial performance. I can't tell you how many folks will call up and say, hey, look, I need to get this business ready to sell. I want to sell it next year or the year after. You're too late. You got to get all these processes, procedures set up, get all these management practices in place, get your team built up well, then you start having good financials for 3 years after that. So you've got a year or two's worth of work to do before those 3 years of financials can be something that you can show to a prospective buyer and be meaningful and be attractive. So if you really want to have a high valuation, you're looking at a minimum 4 or 5 year process, depending on the size business you are. So if you're thinking about selling sometime in the next few years, you got to start now. In fact, you may be too late. So keep that whole big timeline in mind as well as you look at these things.
And I think it goes without saying too, OSHA and silicosis readiness, right? I mean, obviously a huge topic these days. Nobody buying into the business wants, to buy a bad can of worms right now. So that's a huge part. And then the last one on here, we've seen more and more of this. I've seen it lately, especially with private equity and larger acquisitions, key customers getting called and interviewed. Right, it's one thing to say, I do Pulte and they are so happy with me, we've been best friends forever. It's not unusual for them to call and to verify and to check up on the relationship. So that you should be ready for also.
Yep. Trust but verify.
Blake, can you run over to Ted?
Yeah.
What's your list, Ted? What do you look for?
I don't think you emphasized that tall pole in the tent enough. Personal goodwill. Most of our businesses are ran by an entrepreneur that doesn't put in management systems. He's a genius with 100 helpers, right? So when that guy leaves, the business falls apart. So that one you can't estimate too much. You need to train your management team, have systems in place, because that is the riskiest part of deals in our industry, right? Usually there's 20 to 50, 60 employees, and that boss is the key man. So super important.
That's good. Thanks.
But that's a good list. That's a very good list.
Okay, thanks.
And in this industry and others, there's kind of what I think of as a magic benchmark, and that's about $3 million a year in sales. It seems like in manufacturing, and this industry is at its core, it's mostly manufacturing. If you've got an owner who can't delegate, who won't delegate, who doesn't have a strong enough team that can take tasks that have been delegated, execute well without constant oversight, they usually hit about a $3 million annual sales level. And so if you're at that level and you're struggling to break through, stop and look in the mirror and say, okay, how well do you delegate? And if you're struggling with growing past that $3 million point, you're going to struggle with some of these key issues on this slide. So if you're thinking about selling, that's one good self-assessment that you can make, and it's a good rule of thumb to keep in mind.
Yep, there we go.
There we go. Yep.
All right, so this is just a quick little last slide on EBITDA, right? And as we said, it's profit. We're going to give the benchmarking session again tomorrow around lunchtime, and we really hit on big EBITDA drivers. But one of the things we see shops do is they chase after things that aren't as important as other things, right? Everybody likes to talk about CNC tooling costs or consumables, and those are such a small percent of your P&L as opposed to material costs, right? You could easily pull 2%, I say easy from up here, easily pull 2% out of your material costs. Your entire consumables budget may be 2%. So you've got to make sure when you're trying to ramp up your EBITDA that you're looking at the right things, and benchmarking is a great way to do that. Pricing is another way. We put up slides in a couple of the other sessions. Make sure your pricing is in line with your competitors. We see a lot of shops that are leaving money on the table. They're not charging as much as they could. And that, I mean, when you follow a P&L, as long as you're not paying commission, that goes right to the bottom line for you. So make sure your pricing is set up. Upselling your jobs, right? This is things that Rockheads have preached forever. There are so many opportunities, different products out there, whether it's a chip minimizer, or, I mean, there's so many of these different products that can upsell and add to that bottom line, and many of them have no cost associated with them, just pure profit.
Yeah, in fact, Rockheads preaches that a lot. If you'll go to ISFA's Behind the Surface podcast, Jeffrey Grand did a great podcast last fall on the art of upselling. He lists a lot of specific things that you can do that for very little effort and almost no money, you can drive the earnings on each individual job. I talked a little bit in the benchmarking session about how useful management accounting metrics like throughput and operating expense can help you assess individual jobs, can help you assess certain contractors compared to others, can help you assess certain market segments compared to others, and use that data to start driving up your net earnings. So that's a big key as well. A good benchmark on material cost, and this is, again, anecdotal from my experience working with shops. For walk-in retail jobs, your material cost only, not sinks, not contractors, not anything else, just your material cost as a percent of sales should be somewhere around 30%. 25 is awesome. If you're hitting 35, you're okay. If on your retail jobs, your material's up around 40% or higher, you have not kept up with your increase in material costs, so you got to watch that. So those are key things that you can look at to really help drive your earnings up.
From the previous benchmarking session, the average price to the consumer of a retail job for the Rockhead Group is over $98 a foot. So that's the average price across all of our customers. So that's what gives you that 30% material cost, because you're generating so much more cash per square foot.
A lot of folks look at cost and cutting costs as a way to increase profit. I'd encourage you to look at the capacity that you have to generate work in your shop. Look at how effective your folks are in terms of the value-added operations, which is tool and stone time compared to all the moving and reworking and answering and asking questions, all the other stuff. What you'll find typically when you take a close look at is that your front office processes are chewing up some of your capacity in the shop. And if you can clean up your front office processes, you can free up capacity you're already paying for. That's some of the benefit of scheduling with throughput and looking at your real work content and things like that.
Yeah, it's awesome. So that's it for the conversation. We've left a little bit of time for questions and answers. Once you do this.
Yeah, we've got a landing page set up. If you want a copy of the presentation, hit this QR code, put in your email address, and you'll automatically get a copy of this presentation. We also know we're covering a lot of information in a short period of time. This has been a really hot topic. Rich and I did a podcast on this on the Fabricators Coach podcast a couple of months ago. There's a half a dozen more on this topic on the same channel. So we know people may have more questions we can't cover today or tomorrow. So if you hit the QR code, you also have the option of signing up for a webinar in July where we'll do a quick review of this session and spend most of the time just answering your questions and just talking about getting your business ready to sell. So if you want a copy of the presentation or if you want to do a little deeper dive, hit the QR code and sign up. We're not selling anything at the webinar. This is purely for your benefit.
Thank you. So we got a couple minutes. Are there any questions for Rich and Mickey?
Thanks for the presentation. As far as the key man goes, and it's probably for you two and the buyer in the back there, I know that increasingly they've been asking that key man to stay on, right, for 3 to 5 years, whatever it might be. Have you found that their main goal or whatever metric that they're held to is offloading their responsibilities during those 3 to 5?
Yes.
Okay, and does that help or hurt or not have no effect on the multiple depending on how long they stay?
So generally, Ted, don't go anywhere.
Maybe repeat the question. So the question was, go ahead, Rich.
So the question was, with as Ted mentioned, the key man is so important to these transactions. And are we seeing acquirers out there asking that key man to stay longer rather than shorter? And if so, what does that do to multiples? Do you have any thoughts on that, Ted? What's a general, are you 1 to 2 years for your guys?
Yeah, we don't buy a business if the guy's not going to stick around.
Okay.
Particularly, we bought some where there's a partnership and the old guy's ready to go and the young guy who isn't ready to take. The old guy's smart enough to know if he leaves it with the young guy, it's going to go broke. So we buy it, and then that guy gets trained up and managed up and takes it over time. But yeah, there has to be continuous management because we're not moving to town.
Right.
Our structure, right? When we buy a business, the management team that's there in place today has to do it.
So
Sure.
you're
That's
looking
just
at, you're
one
looking
strategy. Some guys want to buy a business and be the day-to-day operator guy. That's entirely different than what we do.
so you guys are looking at long-term, keeping somebody on. Okay, yeah.
And what we've seen too, when I sold my business, we had an immediate payout that was about 2/3 of the total valuation, and then the last third was earned for the next 3 years, right? So management had to, so it effectively does what you say, right? Because you've got to perform for those next 3 years, otherwise you're leaving a lot of money on the table.
Any other questions? Well, thank you. Let's give a round of applause for Rich and Ed real quick. And then at 1:45, we've got developing your effective team. It kind of segues right into this, how to develop your team to be able to raise that value. 1:45 will be back here. Make sure, again, that you visit the Natural Stone Institute, the Rockhead booth, and the ISFA booth. Great assets to your business. Thank you very much. 1:45.